stay on this side so that they hear me out there, even though I don't like speaking from up on here. Introducing Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique is kind of one of the juiciest assignments in all of music because it's just got so much to say about it. I'm not going to say so much about it. I'm going to try to keep it relatively short. Tony, you're supposed to time me right about now. Yeah, okay, all right. So everyone, or most people, know the story behind Symphonie Fantastique, right? Berlioz, in 1827, falls madly in love with a Shakespearean actress in Paris named Harriet Smithson. Of course, she was starring in Hamlet. She was Ophelia. She was famous throughout her. She was actually very famous. It's not like he fell in love with someone in the back of the stage. He fell in love with the star. And she was famous in Paris for her extremely emotional portrayals of the Shakespeare characters. It was kind of a new thing, and in fact, women performing Shakespeare was actually relatively new at that time too. Remember, in the early days of Shakespeare, all the female parts were played by men. So she played Ophelia. He fell madly in love, and he spent the next period of time trying to convince her to fall back in love with him and to marry him. I'll skip ahead in the story and say he eventually got what he wanted. She did marry him. Didn't end that well. We can cover that a different time. But he did actually get his wishes. But the key thing is that he wrote this piece in 1830. It was premiered in 1830. Now, the one thing I just want to say is this music is filled with some of the craziest inventions known to music. If I told you that it was written 50 years later, even 100 years later, you'd say, yeah, that makes sense. It's filled with the most extraordinary invention and creativity. And here's a thought. It was performed first in 1830, exactly 6 years after Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was premiered. Right? The speed with which Berlioz explodes the idea of what's possible in music is extraordinary in and of itself, before we even get to all the other stuff. Now, the reason it's a juicy thing to talk about is because very famously, this piece has a story, has a very explicit story. It's a programmatic symphony. And the story goes, I'm going to read you the opening bit that he published. Now, we're going to come back to this in a second, but the opening bit goes like this. A young musician of unhealthily sensitive nature and endowed with vivid imagination has poisoned himself with opium in a paroxysm of lovesick despair. The narcotic dose he had taken was too weak to cause death, but it has thrown him into a long sleep accompanied by the most extraordinary visions. In this condition, his sensations, his feelings and memories find utterance in his sick brain in the form of musical imagery. Even the beloved one takes the form of melody in his mind, like a fixed idea, which is ever returning and which he hears everywhere. Fixed idea in French is idée fixe, which means a fixed idea. In modern psychology, we would call that a stuck thought, right? Something you can't get rid of. And in the piece of music we're going to hear, throughout all 5 movements, which we're not obviously going to play today, this fixed idea returns over and over and over and over and over again. And it represents, of course, his love, well, the woman herself and his love for her. Now, what's interesting about this, then there are 5 movements. I'll quickly tell you the story. I'm not going to read you the details. The 5 movements go like this. The first movement is called Reveries, Passions, so daydreams and passions. And it is the wild crush. It is a portrait of the longing and the surging desire and the frustration and the jealousy and the determination and the hopelessness of unrequited love, right? And it is as extreme as any version you could possibly imagine. The second movement is called a ball, and it is simply enough a portrait of a ball, and of course his beloved is at the ball. We hear her, she's there. Pretty straightforward. Third movement is in the countryside. In the countryside, we hear 2 shepherds piping melodies. We're going to do this movement next week, the third movement. Today we're doing 1 and 4. They're piping back and forth. This beautiful, beautiful, epically gorgeous melody pours forth. Berlioz, along with being a wild and crazy guy, also wrote the most beautiful music imaginable. His lyric music is all just absolutely gorgeous. And at the end of it, there's only one shepherd piping, and then there's thunder in the distance in the timpani, another great invention of his, to have 4 timpanists playing simultaneously. And we understand that we had 2 and now there's 1. It's hopeless. Okay, then the last 2 movements, very famous. The 4th one we're going to do today, the March to the Scaffold. He dreams that he's killed his beloved and he is going to have his head cut off at the guillotine in Paris. The 5th move, which happens with great delight, you'll see it. Oh, and by the way, including a literal musical portrait of the guillotine going wham, and then the head going floop, floop, floop. You'll hear it, yeah? It's unmissable. And the 5th movement is a witch's Sabbath, right? Where it's like a coven of witches, and his beloved appears, she's one of them, and they're laughing at him and torturing his soul because he's dead, of course. He was killed in the previous movement, and it's wild and crazy, and it ends in absurdity and awesomeness, and we'll hear that again next week. We'll do 3 and 5 next week. But here's the thing that I wanted to tell you about that's really interesting, and then I'm going to stop. How close am I? Am I just dead? Ah, forget it. All right, never mind. I tried. Floop, 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 floop. Yeah, okay. The original version of this, written in 1830, and then the published version in 1845, told the story differently than the version we have today, the 1855 score. In the 1830 score, he very clearly says that the opium is taken between the 3rd and 4th movements. Now, that changes our understanding of the story completely. His original conception was not that he was lovesick and took opium and trying to kill himself and had this really bad trip. And by the way, I've been telling the kids all week long, I'm hoping you're happy about this, that this is good proof that don't do it, right? Bad trips are really bad. It ends really, really bad. All right, so there we go, a little PSA. Thank you very much. All right, thank you, Berlioz. But what's interesting is if he didn't take the drugs at the beginning of the story, then the first movement is no longer a hallucinatory portrait, but in fact, his actual experience. It's the experience of this passionate longing and hope and endless rejection, because that's what he's getting. And you'll hear surges of passion and feeling, and then it pulls back, and surges and surges, and it pulls back, because it's actually what he experienced, right? And then the second movement, same thing, actually a ball. Third movement, in the country. And that's the hinge of the piece, because in the original conception, after the third movement, when we have the one shepherd piping and then no more, at that point, he knows it is hopeless. That's when he takes the opium, and he has these very vivid, completely insane dreams for the 4th and 5th movement. To me, the original version feels more compelling as a narrative than the later one, and you realize that he probably did it to protect himself, right? It was because the actual original version makes him, it's a very different idea to say, this is what I experienced. This was inside me, not outside me, not some thing that happened, right? But rather, these are portraits of my experience. And I think that's also, it's really useful to think about that, because you realize that in this music, Berlioz is doing something that no one had tried to do until this point in music, which is to portray emotional experience as it's being lived. And this is why he is such an urgent figure in the history of music, in the history of art. In the beginning of the 19th century, here he is, and this sort of sweeping ideas we see of romanticism in the 19th century, so focused on the experience, the emotional experience that one has and then tries to portray in art, is right here. He's saying this is it, and that's what leads us to all the incredible stuff to come across all art forms. So I think I love the original version idea of it, and interestingly also, I'll just say, later on in his life, at the beginning he said you had to have the program printed when he was performed. He insisted it had to be there. Later on, he said maybe it's not so important, right? Once he started to change it, and he started to change the idea of it. But you can see that when he first did it, how important it was for everyone in the audience to know that he was writing about his true experience. So we're going to try to get that idea across today. And I hope you enjoyed. Again, today is the 1st and 4th movements of this narrative, and then we're going to do something really weird and come back next week and do the 3rd and 5th movements of the narrative. But at least we'll have the whole thing in our head as a story. So Thanks very much. Let's tune up, and then we will play some Berlioz.